Hi, welcome back. So this is where we left off talking about Edward Tishner, and he was one of Wundt's students. And remember that he developed the school of introspection, and that was eventually a school that failed because of its lack of objectivity. So now let's look at other pioneers in the field. Let's go across the pond now to the United States. Remember that Tishner was a psychologist in Europe. And so now in the United States, we have William James. He was also a philosopher. However, he started the first formal school of psychology at Harvard in the 1870s. And he was very much opposed to Wundt and Tishner. He felt like both of their schools were too theoretical and not very functional. So his ideas shaped the school of functionalism that was also influenced by Darwin. And the purpose of this line of thinking was to focus on how behaviors help us adapt to our environment. So James was mostly interested in how the mind functions and the adaptive or the functional or the useful value of our mental processes. So, the functions of the mind is known formally as the school of functionalism. And functionalism is diametrically opposed to that school of thought that we just talked about called structuralism. So, functionalism focuses on the purpose of consciousness or the function versus the elements or the structure of consciousness, which was structuralism. Some of James' students were G. Stanley Hall, and he was the first individual to receive a PhD in psychology. Another of his students was Mary Whiton Calkins. She completed all of the requirements for a PhD in psychology at Harvard. However, Harvard refused to grant her a PhD simply because she was a woman. Eventually, Calkins established a psychology lab at Wellesley College in 1891. Other psychologists of note were Margaret Floyd Washburn and Francis C. Sumner. Here's a review question for you. What two academic areas did early psychology stem from? I'll let you take a minute to think about that. Well, if you answered philosophy and physiology, great job. So other pioneers. Now let's go back over the big pond to Europe again, and let's focus on Austria. So in the mid to late 1800s, a prominent psychologist that you have heard of, I'm sure, named Sigmund Freud became known. He was an Austrian physician that focused on illness, and he is known for his psychoanalytic theory of mental disorders. I'd like for you to pause this presentation and click on the link. This is a very important video on Sigmund Freud, and I think we're going to learn some very interesting things about him. So take a minute to watch this video. All right, by now you watched that video, and you know that Sigmund Freud is the founder of psychoanalysis. He developed his theory in his clinic, not in a university, unlike other previous psychologists, such as William James or even Wilhelm Wundt. So, Freud believed that human behavior is motivated by unconscious conflicts, which are either sexual or aggressive. He also believed that past experiences, especially those in childhood, are critical to the formation of adult personality and behavior. In other words, Freud thought that we come upon who we are, or we are who we are, very honestly. Our early experiences lay the template for who we are. His theory of psychoanalysis was based on this iceberg concept, where you have the ego, the superego, and the id. And submerged deep beneath the water surface, just like an iceberg, is a big part of our psyche, and in Freud's mind, that was the id. Some of Freud's techniques included dream analysis, so analyzing the meaning of dreams. What do the symbols actually represent in our dreams? He also developed a technique called free association. And this is where someone basically takes their editor in their brain offline and speaks to whatever appears consciously. So, the big picture with Freud is that with the awareness of our unconscious, we will lead more satisfying lives. In other words, Freud firmly believed this, that we are as crazy as our secrets. And if we shine light on our secrets, we have the ability to be more whole and more healthy. So, on this slide, this is actually a copy of Freud's original drawing of the concept of perceptual consciousness. That's what the PCPT-CS stands for at the top at that little egg structure. I'd like for you also to watch these two videos and learn a little bit about that. And for the purpose of this class, you simply need to have a working knowledge or a general understanding of what Freud was talking about. So pause this video presentation and follow those links. All right, so let's just talk about some general schools of psychology. We have psychoanalysis, remember, based on Freud, and this is a personality theory, and it's also a form of psychotherapy that emphasizes the role of the unconscious factors in both personality and behavior. Second school of thought, behaviorism. This emphasizes the study of observable behaviors, especially as they pertain to the process of learning. Third major school of thought is humanistic psychology. And the important aspect of this is that humanists emphasize each person's unique potential for growth and self-direction. So let's look at some key influences in the development of behaviorism. We have Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, and B.F. Skinner. So when we pay attention to this timeline in the history of the development of psychology, by the 1920s, the field of psychology was dramatically changing. So remember, psychology started as the science of mental life, as explained by William James. But by the 1920s, this group of psychologists came along and they dismissed entirely this whole banter about consciousness and introspection. And in their minds, psychology was simply the scientific study of observable behavior. This is all we can truly know about people because we can objectively observe it. Everything else about psychology was way too wishy-washy. So these psychologists were called behaviorists, and they believed that psychologists should only study what can be observed and measured. They said psychology should be an objective science, and psychology only studies behavior without any reference to mental processes. So they believe that science is rooted in observation. To rely on a person's subjective report of how they feel or about their experience is not observable and therefore not valuable. But observing people's behavior is valuable and is the only way to study psychology. So Ivan Pavlov. You probably have heard of Pavlov's dog. Behaviorism grew out of his work, with dogs associating a neutral stimulus with an automatic behavior. So go ahead and pause this presentation and follow this link so you can watch a brief video on Ivan Pavlov. Next, John Watson. John Watson focused on how behaviors are learned and modified. He said emphatically, "Give me a dozen healthy infants in my own specific world to bring them up in, and I guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of scientist that I might select. A doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a merchant, a chef, and yes, even a beggar and a thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. In other words, he believed that he could train or make any person into whatever he wanted them to be. Go ahead and watch this brief video clip of John Watson and his profound experiment. Next, we have in the history of behaviorism, B.F. Skinner. So he was an American psychologist at Harvard, and he studied learning and the effect of reinforcement. He believed that external influences shape behavior and developed the concept of what we call today operant conditioning. We're going to drill into operant conditioning later in the course in more depth. Skinner is known for his air crib. And there was a lot of controversy around his attempts to apply behaviorism to the real world. He identified that environmental influences are vitally important to the development of a child. So he designed an alternative to a baby crib. This was to isolate the child from unhealthy influences. It was simply a plexiglass room. The room could be used as a diaper changing table, and it had temperature control. Skinner's own daughter Deborah was the first baby to live in the air crib. Some people had a negative reaction to this because they linked it to the Skinner box, which is a box that Skinner used to train rats and pigeons, and it also had an electric shock or a buzzer. So a lot of folks thought that Skinner was shocking his own baby. So by the 1960s, rumors that his daughter Deborah grew up to be psychotic and killed herself flourished. But recently she came forward to say that she is fine, she works as an artist, and she's married to a college professor in England. Now let's look at humanism. Humanism was developed by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. And again, this emphasizes the growth and potential of people, free will, self-determination. And this is a much more positive view of the basic forces inside of our psyche than Freud had. By the 1960s, when humanism was well known, these psychologists were not happy with the mechanistic psychology of behaviorism, and they realized that just studying behavior had its limits. So these psychologists, called humanistic psychologists, focus on the ways healthy people strive for self-realization. So, the big picture of humanism is this. Humanistic psychology emphasizes the growth potential of healthy people and the individual potential for personal growth given an environment of support. Abraham Maslow proposed that we are motivated by a hierarchy of needs. If our physiological needs are met, we become concerned with personal safety. If we're safe, we seek love, to be loved, to love ourselves. With our love needs satisfied, we seek self-esteem. So he proposed this theory in the form of a pyramid. Carl Rogers said that people are basically good, and everybody has self-actualizing tendencies. Unless someone is thwarted by an environment that hinders their growth, each person is able to be fulfilled. Rogers believed that for a person to grow, they need an environment and therapy that has three conditions: genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. An offshoot of humanistic psychology is positive psychology, and this basically focuses on the positive emotions, states, traits, and institutions that foster these. And I want to make a personal recommendation. If you're interested in positive psychology or how to lead a happy life, there's a fabulous book called The How of Happiness by Sonia Luimburski. And this is essentially a compilation of the most salient research around happiness. And if you need some interesting reading and are interested in improving your life, go ahead and take a look at this book. It's fabulous. So at this point, I'm going to pause our screencast and give you time to review what we've talked about And in the next one, we're going to finish up the history of psychology.